The stack of papers sliding across the mahogany conference table felt too thick for a standard family agreement. My fingers brushed the stark white pages, noting how unusually stiff the premium cardstock felt against my skin. A sharp, bitter smell of fresh printer toner wafted up from the ink, cutting right through the heavy gardenia perfume my mother wore. Something was terribly wrong. "Sign your trust fund over to my son," my sister snapped, tapping her manicured nail against the signature line. "You are childless. He is the family's future." Across the table, Mom smirked and raised her crystal glass. The ice clinked softly in the quiet room. She took a slow sip of her champagne, looking at me with an expression that demanded total obedience. I said nothing. I kept my breathing steady and looked down at the document. It was not titled as a transfer agreement. The bold black letters at the top clearly read, "Irrevocable disclaimer." They were not asking me to share. They were demanding that I walk away completely. As a 39-year-old certified public accountant, I spent my days doing forensic audits for businesses across South Carolina. I hunted down missing money for a living. I knew exactly what a financial trap looked like. And my own family had just set one right in front of me. I flipped to the third page. My eyes scanned the dense beneficiary language, searching for the exact mechanism they were trying to exploit. Ashley let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Grandpa wanted the family money to stay with people who actually have children," Ashley added. Her voice dropped into that practiced, sympathetic whisper she used to comfort grieving widows at the Ellis family funeral home. "It is just how things are, Morgan." I ignored the insult. I did not look at her perfect blowout or her expensive designer suit. Instead, I looked up at the man sitting quietly at the head of the table. "Who drafted this disclaimer, Henry?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Henry Caldwell had been my grandfather's attorney for more than 3 decades. The old lawyer shifted in his leather chair and adjusted his wire-framed glasses. He looked down at his legal pad. "My office did not prepare that document, Morgan," Henry stated clearly. The air conditioner hummed above us. Mom set her glass down, and the smile slipped slightly from her face. "Please do not make this difficult," Mom said, leaning forward. She folded her hands together, playing the role of the reasonable matriarch. "You have your little forensic accounting consultancy. You have your own condo downtown. You do not need this money, Morgan. Ashley has a family to feed." She spoke as if my independence was just some cute hobby I picked up to pass the time. She conveniently forgot all those late nights I sat in the hospital cafeteria, transferring my personal savings into the company accounts to save the funeral home payroll. I kept our employees paid and the business breathing while she hosted lavish country club luncheons. I was always the quiet, responsible daughter who cleaned up their messes. But today, they wanted my entire inheritance. Ashley reached into her designer bag and pulled out a glossy school photograph. She slid the picture of her 12-year-old boy onto the table, placing it right next to the pen. "Owen needs a real future," Ashley pressed, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "You are taking $3,400,000 right out of his pocket." I stared at the picture. My nephew had his mother's light hair, but he possessed none of her calculated cruelty. He was a good kid. His father shared custody but had always stayed far away from the funeral home and the Ellis family finances. Owen was simply a child they were using as a human shield. "Does Owen know you are sitting here telling me this?" I asked softly. "I speak for my son," Ashley shot back. Her jaw tightened, the facade cracking just a fraction. "Just sign the paper, Morgan." I picked up the heavy brass pen. The cool metal felt grounding in my palm. Mom leaned in closer, a triumphant gleam returning to her eyes. Ashley let out a small breath of relief. They thought I was surrendering. They thought I would cave to the guilt, exactly like I had done for my entire life. I set the pen down on the wood. It made a loud, echoing thud. I pushed the disclaimer back across the table. Then, I turned my attention completely to the old lawyer. Henry nodded slowly. He reached down into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Dark red wax sealed the back flap, stamped clearly with my grandfather's personal crest. "Walter Ellis left very specific instructions for this afternoon," Henry announced. His voice carried the booming authority of a courtroom judge. He ordered me to keep this sealed. I was only permitted to open it if someone in this room tried to force Morgan to refuse her inheritance. Mom gasped. Her hand jerked, sending a pale yellow drop of champagne spilling onto her expensive silk blouse. Ashley froze in her chair, her eyes wide and fixed on the red wax. Henry broke the seal. The sharp sound of tearing paper ripped through the heavy silence of the conference room. He extracted a crisp, clean document and smoothed it out on the table. "This is Walter's final will and testament, executed exactly 6 weeks ago," Henry read aloud. "It completely revokes all prior versions." He paused, letting the reality of his words settle over my mother and sister. "I placed $3,400,000 into an independent trust exclusively for my granddaughter, Morgan Ellis," Henry continued reading. "I establish a separate, independent education trust for my great-grandson Owen, which will be managed solely by the bank." Ashley opened her mouth to protest, but Henry immediately raised his hand to stop her. "There is more," the lawyer warned. "The will stipulates that if Morgan refuses her portion, the funds absolutely do not transfer to Owen. They will be placed into a restitution reserve. Furthermore, Morgan is hereby nominated as the personal representative of the estate, and a comprehensive, independent audit of the funeral home must commence immediately." All the color drained from Ashley's face. The confident funeral home director vanished, replaced by someone who looked utterly terrified. "He cannot do that," Ashley whispered, staring blankly at the wall. Henry reached into the manila envelope one last time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Walter, as the company's controlling shareholder and chairman, also executed an emergency written consent," Henry said. It was countersigned by the independent director. "Effective immediately, Ashley's signing authority and online banking credentials are suspended pending the audit. The company accounts will remain open under the interim manager, so employees and active funerals can still be paid." Absolute silence blanketed the room. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded deafening. My sister turned her head slowly. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with a mix of pure panic and intense hatred. "What did you tell him?" Ashley demanded. I sat back in my chair. I thought about the forged signatures, the missing money, and the quiet dignity of my grandfather. Nearly 40 years of biting my tongue finally came to an end. "Not enough," I answered. "That is why he ordered an audit." The drive back to my condo downtown took exactly 20 minutes. My keys rattled against the solid oak door, sounding loud in the empty hallway. Inside, the air conditioning hit my face, smelling faintly of the lavender cleaner my housekeeper used on Tuesdays. I set my leather briefcase on the granite kitchen island. I did not collapse, and I certainly did not cry. Opening my silver laptop, I immediately checked my business inbox. 4 new emails waited from my consulting firm. 2 messages came from a local restaurant group needing a compliance review, and another arrived from a large dental practice. These were real clients, paying actual money. My life was solid, built on my own reputation, and it belonged completely to me. I did not need the Ellis family funeral home to survive. My cell phone buzzed across the granite counter, shattering the quiet. The screen flashed my sister's name. I hit the speaker button and leaned back against the sink. "You brainwashed him," Ashley hissed. Her voice sounded thin and sharp, completely stripped of the sweet southern charm she always saved for grieving families. "What poison did you pour in his ear while he was dying?" she demanded. I kept my hands resting flat on the cool stone counter. "Any future communication regarding the estate needs to be in writing, Ashley." "You think you won?" my sister spat back. "You think you can just steal my son's future?" I ended the call, opened the encrypted case folder on my laptop, and dictated a contemporaneous memo. I recorded the time, the number she called from, and every statement I could remember while the words were still fresh. That secure folder existed long before today. Looking at the digital icon triggered the memory of how this entire nightmare really started. 5 months ago, I was sitting beside Walter Ellis in his cluttered back office at the funeral home. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light pouring through the blinds. My grandfather smelled like peppermint drops and old wool, a comforting scent from my childhood. He did not give me a grand speech about corporate fraud or family betrayal. The old man simply slid a faded index card across his green leather desk pad. A widow's name was written in his neat cursive. Next to her name sat a 9-digit contract number. Mrs. Gable received a second bill for her husband's casket, Walter had said softly, looking out the window at the employee parking lot. See if the system made a mistake, Morgan. Taking that card, I spent the next evening at this very kitchen island pulling up the master customer ledger. Mrs. Gable had paid her account in full 3 years prior, yet her payment never migrated to the monthly pre-need report. The money just vanished into the operating account without a trace. A week later, I found another missing contract, and shortly after that, a third anomaly appeared. I built a separate spreadsheet on my personal hard drive to track the mess. Column A held the customer name. Column B recorded the payment date. Column C tracked the exact username of whoever held administrative access that specific day. There were no accusations in my file. I only dealt with cold data. Returning to his office a week later, I found Walter waiting. He asked if I was absolutely sure about the errors. I do not have enough evidence to make a formal claim yet, I told him. A financial accusation required airtight proof, not just 3 weird accounting glitches. Walter nodded slowly. A deep sigh rattled in his chest, and I could tell he appreciated my patience. He reached into his tweed vest pocket, pulling out a heavy brass key. The metal felt warm when he pressed it firmly into my palm. Not yet, he whispered. He refused to tell me what lock it fit. Now, standing in my quiet kitchen, I pulled that same brass key from my jacket pocket and placed it beside my laptop. Walter had also left a small wooden document box in the trunk of my car, delivered quietly by Henry's paralegal after the memorial service. I retrieved the box from my briefcase and set it on the kitchen island. The box was secured only by a simple brass latch. I lifted it and opened the lid. Inside sat a thick stack of index cards, wrapped tightly in a rubber band. My grandfather had not given me the final answer. He had merely watched me uncover the pattern on my own, and once he trusted my judgment, he gathered the rest of the puzzle pieces. I untied the band and started typing the new contract numbers into my spreadsheet. The rows multiplied rapidly. It was not 3 missing accounts. It was not 10. 47 families had their funeral trust money diverted. The cell phone vibrated again, shaking so hard it nearly fell off the counter. This time, the caller identification showed Daniel Price. Walter had hired the independent forensic accountant behind everyone's back 2 months ago. I answered the call on the first ring. I just finished comparing the customer payment logs to the corporate trustee reports, Daniel said. His voice sounded incredibly heavy, carrying the distinct weight of disastrous news. We are not looking at a paperwork glitch, Morgan, the accountant continued. We are missing more than $1 million. $1 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I thanked Daniel and disconnected the call, leaning my hands flat against the cold granite of my kitchen island. The silence in my condo felt entirely different now. It was not just a case of corporate mismanagement or messy bookkeeping anymore. This was a massive, deliberate theft, and I had personally handed the thieves the perfect warning. My chest tightened as a memory surfaced from exactly 90 days ago. Driving to my parents' house on a quiet Tuesday evening, rain had drummed steadily against the windshield of my car. My mother stood at her marble kitchen island, slicing lemons for iced tea. The room smelled of citrus and expensive floor wax, perfectly curated to project an image of absolute domestic grace. Inside my leather tote bag sat a manila folder with printouts of 3 suspicious transactions. Holding back the rest of my file seemed like the right choice at the time, because I desperately wanted to believe this was a terrible misunderstanding. Detailing the missing funds quietly, I made sure my mother understood I had not accused my sister of anything yet. I only wanted Patricia to intervene and stop whatever financial shell game was happening before it destroyed the family business. Patricia Ellis dropped her silver knife onto the marble counter. Tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly timed and thoroughly convincing. Reaching across the island, her cold, wet fingers gripped my wrist tightly. She talked about how stressed Ashley was with opening the new branch facility. The immense pressure of raising a 12-year-old boy became her ultimate excuse. Begging me to wait 48 hours before I told Walter about the discrepancies, my mother promised to handle the situation discreetly. Like a fool, I agreed to wait. The next morning, the trap snapped shut. Sitting at my home desk, I typed my credentials into the funeral home accounting portal just to check the daily balances. The screen flashed red. Incorrect password. Clicking the recovery button revealed that the backup email address had been changed overnight to a generic administrative domain. My account was not disabled or locked out by the system. It was completely hijacked. My sister, holding full administrative rights, had reset my password and altered my recovery methods. She kept my profile active, but I was entirely locked out of the system. Then the physical erasure began. I drove down to the office to check the basement storage room. The air down there always smelled of old paper and damp concrete. Walking to the third aisle, I found an empty space on the metal shelving. The 2 cardboard boxes containing the original hard copy files for those 3 suspicious accounts were gone. When I walked upstairs to meet with the senior accounts manager, her assistant handed me a sticky note saying the meeting was canceled indefinitely due to security upgrades. By noon, an explosive email hit the inbox of every board member. Ashley wrote a scathing message claiming I had accessed sensitive data far beyond my consulting authority. The message heavily implied I was attempting to steal confidential Shodan/Shogun, Shoder Sessions, Shodan Sessions 17 the 7 5 minutes later, a follow-up message arrived from our mother. Patricia completely validated the lie. The email informed the board I was emotionally unstable regarding our grandfather and his estate, suggesting I needed time away from the company. Driving straight back to that pristine suburban kitchen felt like a blur. My mother was sitting at the breakfast nook, casually sipping her lemon tea. The woman did not even flinch when I walked through the door. I asked how she could possibly cover up a crime involving grieving families who had trusted us with their savings. "I was protecting the daughter who still has a child to raise," she replied calmly, taking another slow sip of her drink. Something cold and sharp settled behind my ribs. The woman who raised me had just made her choice, and it was not me. I did not scream, and I did not throw the porcelain teacup against the wall. I simply asked if she understood that our clients had handed over their life savings to bury their loved ones. Her answer revolved entirely around the importance of our family reputation in Greenville County. Not a single word about basic morality crossed her lips. Walking out the door, I ceased all direct verbal contact with them. Every message from that day forward went strictly through writing. Formal preservation requests were sent out to Walter, to his attorney, and to the independent auditor. I needed a paper trail for everything. Back in the present, standing in my quiet condo, the laptop chimed with an incoming message. Henry Caldwell just forwarded a newly extracted digital access log. Opening the spreadsheet, I scanned the raw data. The digital footprint told a fascinating story. My hijacked username had been highly active long after my password was reset. Whoever took control of my credentials went straight into the server and began altering fulfillment records on dozens of pre-need contracts. My phone rang again, vibrating violently against the counter. Daniel Price was calling back with his technical analysis of those exact logs. I tracked the Internet Protocol address for those specific file modifications, the accountant said immediately, skipping any polite greetings. The login using your hijacked name originated from the desktop computer sitting inside your sister's private office. He paused, letting the heavy implications sink in. The administrative reset happened right before the data was scrubbed, to make it look like I was the one doctoring the books. "It gets worse, Morgan," Daniel continued, his voice dropping into a somber whisper. "I checked the timestamps on those fraudulent edits. Whoever used your account to falsify those records did it exactly 2 weeks ago, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon." My breath caught in my throat. At 3 o'clock that specific afternoon, I was nowhere near a computer terminal. I had been sitting in the intensive care unit, listening to the steady beep of a heart monitor, holding Walter Ellis's hand while he struggled to breathe. Henry Caldwell occupied a corner office that smelled of lemon furniture polish and old leather bindings. Sitting across the massive mahogany desk, Daniel Price slid a printed digital access log toward me. The forensic accountant tapped a thick finger against the highlighted row, confirming exactly what he had told me on the phone. My hijacked credential was used from a computer inside the funeral home. while I sat in the intensive care unit listening to my grandfather struggle to breathe. Ashley left a perfect digital fingerprint, Daniel stated, leaning back in his chair. We can take this to the police right now and prove she compromised your access. Not yet, I replied, folding the log sheet and placing it inside my briefcase. Let them keep thinking the frame job worked. People get sloppy when they believe they are winning. Henry nodded in agreement, pushing his heavy chair away from the desk. The old attorney instructed me to grab my coat because Walter Ellis had left one more protective measure in place, and it required a short trip down the street. The downtown bank vault felt 10 degrees colder than the lobby. A manager escorted us to a wall of brushed steel compartments, leaving us alone in the quiet room. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket. The metal slid smoothly into the designated lock, and turning it produced a heavy, satisfying click. Pulling the metal drawer free, I found no stacks of hidden cash or dramatic written confessions. A crisp manila folder rested at the bottom. Inside sat a stack of printed ledgers, several handwritten client complaints, and a single sheet of watermarked firm paper. I read the bold type at the top. It was a formal authorization letter, signed and notarized by my grandfather exactly 2 weeks before my sister began doctoring the digital files under my name. The document explicitly granted me full authority to investigate all pre-need contract numbers and retain read-only copies of the data. Walter had quietly built a legal shield around me, knowing the storm would eventually hit, but he still expected me to uncover the actual mechanism of the theft on my own. Returning to the lawyer's office, Daniel spread a new set of documents across the table. They were invoices made out to a vendor called Heritage Family Consulting. The billing statements lacked any specific service details, listing only vague consultation fees in perfectly round numbers that repeated month after month. I ran the corporate registration, Daniel explained, pointing to a state tax printout. This company has no employees and no physical storefront. The mailing address links directly to a residential property located out by the county lake. A cold wave washed over me. For the past 3 years, my mother constantly bragged about a beautiful lake house she frequently visited, always claiming it belonged to a wealthy friend from her country club. Daniel pulled up the property records, and the truth stared back at us in black and white. The mortgage payments for that house perfectly matched the monthly transfers flowing out of the funeral home to the consulting firm. My mother was not just protecting her golden child. Patricia was directly siphoning stolen client funds to pay for her luxury waterfront lifestyle. Run a formal tracing report on every dime that went to that house, I instructed Daniel, keeping my voice perfectly level. Do not contact them. We build the cage before we show them the lock. 2 hours later, a sharp knock rattled the front door of my condo. Looking through the peephole, I saw Patricia standing in the hallway, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a forced, sympathetic smile. Opening the door, I did not step aside to let her in. I kept my hand firmly on the brass knob, letting the physical boundary do the talking. You are embarrassing your grandfather, Patricia said softly, dropping the sympathetic act the moment she realized she was not getting an invitation inside. You are going to destroy the business and ruin the livelihood of every employee sitting in that building. I watched her eyes dart over my shoulder. The wooden lockbox Walter left me sat open on the kitchen island, surrounded by stacks of recovered ledgers. Her gaze locked onto the brass key resting beside the paperwork. The color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face. She realized the containment strategy had completely failed. You really should have signed that paper when Ashley gave you the chance, Patricia whispered, her voice tightening with genuine panic. The chance to do what? I asked, refusing to break eye contact. The woman who raised me took a step back into the hallway, desperate to regain control of the narrative. To make the books whole, she snapped quickly, turning on her heel. I closed the heavy door, walked straight to my desk, and immediately wrote down her exact phrasing. The scent of wilting lilies and lemon floor wax hung thick inside the Ellis family funeral home. Mourners in dark suits and conservative dresses milled around the polished mahogany casket. Standing near the back wall, keeping my distance from the receiving line, I watched the performance unfold. My sister stood at the podium, gripping the microphone with perfectly manicured hands. Ashley wore a tailored black dress that screamed quiet wealth, looking every bit the grieving heir. Walter Ellis built this legacy for the future, Ashley told the crowded room, her voice trembling just the right amount to draw sympathy. He believed in family. He believed in providing for the next generation, for those of us actually raising children to carry on his name. He never wanted his life's work dismantled out of greed. Several heads turned in my direction. The quiet whispers started immediately, traveling like a wave through the pews. I kept my expression completely blank and took a slow sip of lukewarm water from my paper cup. An older woman, a longtime client of the firm, walked over and touched my arm. She asked in a hushed, conspiratorial tone if the terrible rumors were true, if I was actually dragging my own sister into court over the family inheritance. The estate is simply being processed according to standard legal procedures, Mrs. Higgins, I answered quietly. Grandpa wanted everything documented properly. Offering nothing else, I watched the client nod slowly and walk away. Across the room, Ashley narrowed her eyes. Her jaw tightened when she realized I was not going to throw a tantrum and make myself look like the unstable, greedy villain she desperately needed me to be. A small tug on my sleeve pulled my attention away from the podium. My 12-year-old nephew stood there, looking uncomfortable in his stiff collar and dark tie. Owen glanced over his shoulder to make sure his mother was still busy shaking hands with the mayor. "Mom said you are trying to take my future away," the boy mumbled, staring down at his polished dress shoes. "She said you want my college money because you are mad at her." Hearing those words coming from a child felt like a physical blow. The woman had absolutely no boundaries when it came to using her son as a weapon. I crouched down slightly to meet his eye level, making sure my voice carried nothing but calm certainty. "Your education trust is perfectly safe, Owen," I told him gently. "The bank manages that money, and no one can take it from you. What your great-grandfather left to me was never part of your fund. Do you understand?" Owen searched my face for a long moment before giving a small, slow nod. I did not ask him to keep our conversation a secret, and I did not ask him to doubt his mother. He already carried enough weight on his young shoulders. It was time to leave before the tension escalated any further, but a trembling hand suddenly pressed a small folded piece of paper into my palm. Nora Whitfield, the senior bookkeeper who had worked for our family for 20 years, stood directly beside me. She looked absolutely terrified. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes darted frantically toward the front of the chapel. "I cannot afford to lose my pension, Morgan," the older woman whispered rapidly. Her breath smelled of stale coffee and peppermint. "But I cannot go to jail for them either. Look at the paper." Before I could ask a single question, Nora slipped through the crowd and vanished into the hallway leading to the staff break room. I walked out the heavy brass front doors, letting the humid South Carolina air hit my face. Unfolding the small square of notebook paper, I found a handwritten list of internal transaction codes. Sitting inside my locked car, I pulled out my phone and dialed the forensic accountant. I read the specific string of numbers and letters to Daniel Price. The typing sounds on his end lasted only a few seconds before a sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. "Those codes represent immediate merchandise sales," Daniel explained, his voice thick with disbelief. "They used these specific tags to bypass the trust requirements entirely. If a payment was coded this way, the system automatically excluded it from the monthly pre-need report." My fingers gripped the leather steering wheel. I asked if he could trace exactly who authorized the bypass. "Give me 5 minutes," the accountant replied, hanging up immediately. Through the tinted windshield, I watched the funeral guests beginning to exit the building. Ashley stood on the front steps, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She pointed toward my parked car and whispered something to a group of board members. They all shook their heads in collective pity. She truly thought she had secured her victory by driving me away in absolute shame. My phone vibrated in my lap, signaling a new email. Daniel had just recovered a deleted chain from the main server backup, and he forwarded it directly to my private inbox. The message thread was crystal clear. The bottom email contained an explicit, written directive from my sister to the bookkeeper. Ashley ordered Nora to code a massive client deposit as immediate merchandise and strictly instructed her to keep the transaction off the monthly trust report. Scrolling up, I read the bookkeeper's desperate reply. Nora had warned her boss that bypassing the trust was a severe compliance violation. The final response from Ashley sat at the very top, typed in bold black letters. "Just do it." Mom approved the method. I finally had the written order that could bring the entire scheme down. The entire scheme was documented, proving that both my sister and my mother orchestrated the theft together. But Daniel was not finished delivering miracles today. A second notification popped up on my screen, delivering an attached file. The accountant had recovered one more document from the deleted server archives. Opening the attachment, I stared at a scanned copy of the official corporate board minutes. The typed page ratified the exact accounting method my sister had just ordered, granting full executive permission to use the merchandise bypass codes to solve cash flow problems. At first glance, it looked like a perfect, bulletproof legal shield. Then I looked closer at the date stamped across the top right corner. The supposed emergency board meeting took place on the 14th of October. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack the night before. On the exact day this document claimed Walter Ellis chaired a corporate meeting and signed an approval resolution, he was lying completely unconscious in a hospital bed recovering from emergency bypass surgery. And the only other board member listed in attendance had been on a cruise ship somewhere near the coast of Canada. The digital footprint of the forged board minutes cast a harsh blue glow across my kitchen island. Daniel had spent the entire morning running a metadata analysis on the file, and the results completely destroyed my sister's manufactured timeline. The document claiming my grandfather had authorized the accounting bypass was authored 3 weeks after the date typed at the top of the page. Furthermore, the file creation originated from a laptop registered directly to Patricia Ellis. The electronic signature belonging to Walter Ellis was not properly certified software, but rather a simple image file copied and pasted from a folder my mother controlled. They had built a paper shield, and it was already disintegrating. The realization that their plan was failing must have finally set in, because 2 days later, a courier delivered a formal invitation to a private mediation session. We met in a neutral, windowless conference room at a downtown arbitration firm. The space smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Ashley and Patricia sat together on one side of the long glass table, looking entirely different than they had at the funeral reception. My sister wore a plain gray sweater instead of her designer suits, and our mother kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, hiding her manicured nails. Ashley pushed a glossy white folder across the glass. She forced a tight, unnatural smile. "We want to heal this family, Morgan," my sister offered, her voice adopting that sickly sweet tone again. "We are willing to step back. We will not contest the second will. And you can keep the entire trust fund. The business will even repay that old cash loan you made a few years ago." I left the folder sitting untouched in the center of the table. A settlement offer from these two meant they were absolutely terrified of what Daniel was finding in the server archives. "In exchange for what?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Patricia cleared her throat, leaning forward just a fraction. "In exchange for a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and the immediate termination of the independent audit. We just want to put this tragic misunderstanding behind us." The sheer audacity of the proposal hung heavily in the stale air. They were trying to buy my silence, using the very inheritance my grandfather had already legally secured for me. "Why are you offering to give me something that already belongs to me?" I asked quietly, watching the practiced warmth vanish from my mother's face. The matriarch of the Ellis family immediately abandoned the peaceful negotiator routine. Her shoulders stiffened, and her voice dropped into a sharp, threatening cadence. "If that funeral home collapses because of an audit, dozens of innocent employees will lose their jobs," Patricia warned, narrowing her eyes. "Generations of clients will drag our name through the mud, and every single one of them will blame you for burning the business to the ground over a personal vendetta." Ashley quickly jumped in to reinforce the guilt trip. "And Owen will grow up knowing his aunt chose a pile of money over her own blood. Is that really the legacy you want to leave him?" Hearing them use the staff and a 12-year-old boy as emotional leverage only confirmed my decision. I reached out, pushed the white folder right back across the glass, and stood up from my chair. "Any future offers must be submitted directly through Henry Caldwell," I told them, picking up my briefcase. I walked out of the room without looking back, leaving them to sit in the silence of their own failing conspiracy. The real reason behind their sudden desperation arrived in my inbox exactly 3 hours later. Daniel had requested a preservation image of the old company cell phone Ashley used during the previous fiscal year. Retrieving deleted text messages required specific software, but the forensic accountant managed to extract a handful of critical fragments. He sent the clean transcript directly to my encrypted drive. Sitting on my living room sofa, I read the brief exchange between my sister and my mother. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the morning they had tried to force me into signing the disclaimer. Ashley had written the first message. Once Morgan signs, Owen's trust covers the gap before the inspection. A minute later, Patricia had replied, "Then the books will look whole again. Do not let her leave without signing." The entire puzzle finally snapped together. That meeting in the lawyer's office had never been about raw greed or securing a golden future for my nephew. A state regulatory inspection was looming, and the funeral home accounts were short by over $1 million. If I had signed that irrevocable disclaimer, Owen would have become the contingent beneficiary under the earlier will. Ashley had already prepared to petition for control over the minor's inherited property. The state inspection was still several months away. Her plan was to ask the probate court for authority to place part of Owen's inheritance into what she would describe as a temporary, secured investment in the family company. Once the money entered the funeral home's accounts, she intended to use it to cover the missing balances before the inspectors arrived. The plan was reckless and far from guaranteed, but they believed Owen's name and the family business would make the court accept it. They did not want to make Owen rich. They needed his name to launder the money. A quiet knock at my front door pulled me away from the digital transcript. Checking the peephole, I saw my nephew standing in the hallway, clutching the straps of his school backpack. He looked pale and incredibly small. Opening the door, I invited him inside and offered him a glass of water. Owen barely touched the glass. He set it on the kitchen island and looked up at me with red, exhausted eyes. "I heard Mom yelling on the phone with her private lawyer this afternoon," the boy mumbled, his voice trembling slightly. "She did not know I was in the hallway." I heard her say the boy's name was the cleanest way to move it. Owen wrapped his arms around his ribs, looking like he was trying to hold himself together. He asked me what his mother had actually used his name for. I did not want to drag a child into a criminal investigation, but lying to him would only make me exactly like the woman who raised him. I chose my words with intense care, focusing strictly on the truth without adding unnecessary venom. "Your mother did not steal for your future, Owen," I told him gently, maintaining steady eye contact. "She tried to hide behind it." The boy absorbed the heavy truth in complete silence. He unzipped the front pocket of his backpack and pulled out a blank, unaddressed white envelope. "Then why did she tell me I had to copy this letter in my own handwriting right after my birthday?" Owen asked, his voice cracking as he slid the envelope across the granite counter. "She said the trustee would have to listen to me." The unaddressed envelope felt disturbingly thin, the paper stock far too cheap for any official legal communication. I carefully opened the flap. Inside was a typed draft titled Statement of Wishes, along with a blank sheet of lined paper. A yellow note in Ashley's handwriting was attached to the front. "Copy this exactly after your birthday. Sign your full name. Do not change anything." The letter was written as if the request had come directly from Owen. It stated that he wanted his mother to receive all information about the education trust, and asked the corporate trustee to treat her as his family liaison and trust advisor. My heart sank as I read the words. It was a transparent attempt to manufacture psychological leverage, a desperate gamble to make the corporate trustee believe the child himself wanted his mother in control. I handed the draft back to Owen, making sure he understood that his signature or handwriting could not override the ironclad language of a testamentary trust. The document possessed absolutely no legal power to grant my sister access to those funds, but seeing it written in his own hand confirmed how deeply she had been willing to exploit his trust for her own gain. I gave the draft to Henry and asked him to notify the corporate trustee. The bank confirmed in writing that Owen's letter could not appoint Ashley, transfer authority, or change the terms of the trust. The trustee then arranged for an independent representative to explain Owen's rights without allowing Ashley to control the conversation. The probate hearing proved to be a grueling test of endurance. Ashley sat at the defense table, whispering urgently to her attorney, while Patricia sobbed openly in the front row, painting a vivid picture of a distraught, grieving mother. When the judge finally allowed us to speak, I watched my sister's lawyer stand to argue that my grandfather was mentally incapacitated during the signing of his second will. They accused me of isolating a dying man, claiming I had manipulated a vulnerable, confused patient into rewriting his legacy to suit my own greed. Henry Caldwell stepped forward, his calm demeanor cutting through the manufactured drama in the courtroom. He presented a complete, meticulously documented timeline. He showed that my investigation into the funeral home anomalies began weeks before the second will was even drafted, proving my actions were reactive rather than predatory. He submitted the medical capacity evaluation, conducted by a neurologist the very morning my grandfather signed the document, along with signed affidavits from 2 independent witnesses who observed no signs of confusion or duress. When I finally took the stand, the cross-examination felt like walking through a minefield. The opposing counsel demanded to know if I had hoped for an inheritance, his voice sharp and aggressive. I did not blink. I told the court that I had certainly hoped my grandfather would live for many more years, but I refused to pretend that his financial legacy was unimportant. That simple, brutal honesty seemed to deflate the lawyer's rehearsed narrative. He could not make me look like a lying, opportunistic villain, because my personal financial independence was impossible to deny. After reviewing the evidence, the judge ruled in our favor, officially recognizing the later will as valid and dismissing the claims of undue influence. As we filed out of the courtroom, I heard my sister and mother arguing in the hallway, their voices rising in a frantic, ugly symphony of blame. Patricia screamed that Ashley had been the one to store the metadata on the laptop, and Ashley snapped back that my mother had been the one to personally register the shell company. They had finally started tearing each other apart, and I did not intervene. Nora approached me near the exit, her hands trembling as she pulled out her weathered notebook. She showed me the final entry, a haunting quote she had scribbled down during a meeting months ago. Patricia had looked at the stacks of paperwork and whispered that if the state inspection came early, they would need to burn the old boxes. Nora looked me in the eye, her expression softening into something like hope. She told me that those boxes were never destroyed because my grandfather had secretly moved them to a secure location long before the audit ever began. The original records were safe, and they were ready to be handed over to the authorities. Henry Caldwell kept his promise, and the boxes Walter had hidden were moved under a strict chain of custody directly to the prosecutor's office. These weren't just random files. Inside sat every original pre-need contract, the missing deposit slips, and the handwritten notes my grandfather made regarding the specific dates when the accounting department went dark. Daniel Price spent 2 days scanning every document, creating a digital trail that led straight from the initial customer payment to the private bank accounts my mother and sister treated like their own personal piggy bank. The total amount diverted reached over $1,080,000. Every dollar was accounted for. We watched the money move from the funeral home's operating account into Heritage Family Consulting, and then immediately out to pay off the massive mortgage on that lake house and the high balance on my mother's private credit cards. It was not a complicated scheme, but it was incredibly arrogant, built on the assumption that no one would ever bother to actually check the ledger entries against the bank statements. The formal depositions took place in a sterile room downtown. Ashley arrived first, looking like a ghost of her former self. Under oath, she finally admitted to ordering the fraudulent coding, but her defense quickly shifted toward total betrayal. She told the investigators that Patricia had assured her the practice was perfectly legal and claimed my grandfather had signed off on every single transaction during those fake board meetings. When the prosecutor presented the text message regarding covering the gap before the state inspection, my sister laughed nervously and claimed the word gap referred only to a temporary cash flow problem, not a massive criminal theft. Patricia appeared next, her demeanor far colder than it had been in the courtroom. She insisted that Ashley ran the entire operation and that she had merely signed whatever papers were put in front of her. The investigator, a calm man with graying hair, slid the laptop metadata and shell company registration documents across the table. He showed her the bank transfers that personally benefited her own lifestyle. The mask finally shattered. My mother leaned forward, her face reddening with a sudden, violent rage, and began listing every single way my sister had manipulated her into participating. The two women spent 4 hours in that room actively dismantling each other's legal defenses, providing the state with enough evidence to secure convictions for them both. Nora's notebook and her subsequent testimony acted as the final nail, confirming that Ashley had repeatedly issued commands to bypass the trust, despite clear warnings that the actions were illegal. Later that evening, Henry and I reviewed the certified recordings and transcripts from both interviews. Reading their statements side by side was not a moment of triumph. Watching the people who raised me tear each other apart for the sake of a plea deal felt like watching a slow-motion car wreck. I didn't feel happy, but I finally felt free of the toxic machinery they had built to keep their secrets buried. My sister made one final, desperate attempt to save herself near the end of the day. She looked directly at the court reporter and claimed I had stolen $100,000 from the company accounts years ago, framing me as the original thief. The prosecutor didn't even need to look at me before dismissing the accusation. I produced the original promissory note, the signed board approval for the business loan, and the stamped bank receipt proving that every cent had been repaid with interest. That loan had saved the company payroll during a bad winter, and my meticulous record-keeping proved it was a legitimate business transaction, standing in stark contrast to the shadowy theft my sister had orchestrated. Late that evening, Henry called my cell phone while I was sitting alone in my condo, staring at the quiet city lights. The prosecutor was preparing to file formal charges against both of them the following morning. "Do they know what is coming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Henry paused for a long moment before answering. "Ashley does. Her attorney submitted a formal proffer to the prosecutor 30 minutes ago. She is offering testimony against your mother in exchange for a reduced sentence." The legal machinery moved with an efficiency that felt both cold and inevitable. Because the mountain of evidence was insurmountable, both women opted to accept separate plea agreements rather than drag the proceedings through a public trial that would have certainly resulted in even harsher consequences. I stayed far away from those backroom negotiations. My only contribution to the state's case was a formal victim impact statement detailing exactly how the financial manipulation had crippled the firm's compliance standards and betrayed the trust of our most vulnerable clients. 3 days before the sentencing hearing, my mother called me from a restricted line. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of all the haughty authority she had worn like armor for so many years. She begged me to write a character reference for the judge, demanding that I verify she was a loving mother who only ever wanted the best for her daughters. I listened to her sob about her legacy, then I lowered the phone slowly. "The truth is not a gift I have the power to alter, Mother," I told her, my voice as steady as granite. I ended the call without another word, refusing to let her rewrite history one final time. My nephew faced his own impossible choice when his mother insisted he write a letter to the court, pleading for mercy so she could remain home to raise him. Owen came to see me, looking haunted by the expectations of an adult world he was far too young to navigate. I didn't tell him what to do. I simply sat with him in my kitchen and reminded him that he was not responsible for the consequences of his mother's choices. After an hour of silence, he picked up a pen. He did not write a plea for mercy. Instead, he typed a short, painful admission to the judge, stating that while he loved his mother, he refused to lie for her. The sentencing day arrived under a bright, indifferent sun. Patricia received 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by a strict period of supervised release. She was hit with a joint restitution order that would force the sale of the lake house and all other assets she had acquired through the shell vendor, effectively stripping her of the social status she had spent decades curating. The local historical society and the garden club she ran for years both voted to strip her of her memberships, scrubbing her name from their records by the time the bailiff led her away. Ashley's sentence was substantially harsher, reflecting her role as the primary architect of the fraud. The judge handed down a 4-year term in state prison, followed by long-term probation and a permanent ban from ever working in funeral pre-need management again. 3 months later, after a separate licensing hearing, the state regulatory board permanently revoked Ashley's professional licenses and barred her from working in pre-need management. Her name was removed from the lobby plaque, the current officer list, and every account carrying signing authority. Her past transactions remained preserved in the permanent audit record, exactly where they belonged. Standing in the hallway of the courthouse, I watched my sister stop for a brief moment before the guards ushered her toward the holding area. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a mixture of resentment and genuine disbelief. She told me that I had finally succeeded in destroying the family and stripping Owen of any real future. I stood my ground, refusing to flinch or look away from her. "You did not protect his future," I answered, my words cutting through the noisy corridor. "You tried to hide inside it." She was led away, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the judicial wing. I turned toward the exit, expecting to feel an overwhelming rush of victory, but found only a heavy, hollow stillness. Owen did not run after the guards. He stood by the heavy oak doors, watching his mother go with a look of profound, quiet clarity. His father, who had already been granted temporary primary custody, stepped forward and rested a hand on Owen's shoulder. I joined them as we walked out into the afternoon light. I would remain his aunt and a safe person in his life, but I would not replace either of his parents. After the dust settled and the media circus finally moved on, the interim manager at the funeral home reached out to me during the transition period. He stood in the lobby, gesturing to the empty office that used to belong to my grandfather, and asked if I was ready to assume the role of permanent chief executive. I looked up at the wall, where the heavy wooden sign still displayed the Ellis family name in polished brass letters. I thought about the hours I had spent correcting the ledgers, the years of quiet sacrifice, and the way the entire building still felt haunted by the expectations I had spent my life trying to meet. "I have one last thing to do before I answer," I told him, turning my back on the office to walk out the front door for the very last time. The process of cleaning up the wreckage left behind by my mother and sister felt like excavating a site after a bomb blast. I spent months working alongside the independent management team, my eyes straining as I meticulously verified every single pre-need contract against our actual assets. It was slow, agonizing work. We focused our energy on making every affected family whole, ensuring that every service promised in those original documents was honored and paid for. I didn't care about making a profit that year. I cared about clearing the ledger of every lie they had embedded into our systems. I insisted on creating a new, transparent compliance protocol that required dual authentication for every financial transfer, effectively removing the possibility of anyone ever abusing the system again. We set up an employee ownership component, giving the people who actually showed up every day and did the work a stake in our future. It felt right. They were the ones who suffered the most when the secrets came to light, and they deserved to be the ones who saw the business survive. When the management team finally approached me again to offer the permanent chief executive position, I looked at the polished brass sign in the lobby one last time. People in this town, but I realized that taking the job meant I would still be defining my worth through the lens of their expectations. I would be trapped in the same loop I had spent most of my life trying to escape. "I cannot do it," I told the board members during our final transition meeting. "I am closing this chapter. The firm belongs to you and the employees now." I kept my portion of the trust fund. It was my money, and I refused to apologize for holding on to it. That $3,400,000 represented years of being the family workhorse, the one who stayed silent while everyone else spent, and the one who cleaned up the mess when the roof finally caved in. I used a significant portion of that capital to expand my private forensic consulting firm, finally turning my side project into a full-time business where I chose my clients and set my own rules. Owen kept his own independent education trust, and for the first time, he seemed to be breathing properly. He was in school, playing sports, and getting to be a child, without his mother constantly whispering plans in his ear. I didn't try to be his new mother, and I certainly didn't try to buy his affection. I just stayed in the background, making sure his trust remained untouchable. A few months after the sentencing hearings concluded, a thick envelope arrived at my office. The return address was a simple P.O. box, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was addressed to my daughter, a label that felt like a final, desperate attempt to reclaim a narrative that had already been taken away. I did not open the envelope. I did not need to know what kind of excuses she had scratched onto the paper. Instead, I handed it back to my lawyer with a set of ironclad instructions. My mother was permitted to send correspondence only if she followed 3 non-negotiable rules: no blame, no requests for money, and absolutely no attempts to use my nephew as a pawn to manipulate the situation. If the letter failed any of those tests, it was to be returned, unopened, to the sender. This wasn't a punishment. It was simply the boundary that should have existed for my entire life. Walking back into my condo on a quiet Tuesday evening, I felt the familiar weight of the brass key resting in my pocket. I moved over to my desk, opened the drawer, and tucked the key away in a small wooden tray beside my consulting business license. It no longer represented a secret I had to solve for them, or a trap I had to navigate to stay alive. The brass was just a piece of metal now. It was a souvenir of a battle that was finally completely over, and a reminder that Walter Ellis had trusted me to handle the truth. My phone rang just as the sun started to set. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, expecting a new client. "Is this Morgan Ellis?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded breathless, her voice cracking with the kind of frantic energy I recognized all too well. "My mother passed away last week. She prepaid for her funeral at a local home 5 years ago, but now they are telling me they have no record of her contract. They said there is no money, and they are refusing to honor the prepaid contract. They want another $5,000 before they will proceed with the funeral arrangements." I leaned back in my office chair and felt the cool air of the room wash over me. The world was full of people who thought they could hide in the shadows, believing no one would ever bother to look at the numbers. I reached for a new case folder, opened my laptop, and began to type. "Start from the beginning," I told her, my voice steady and calm. "Tell me everything." For most of my life, my family called my silence weakness. They were always looking for the noise, the drama, and the performance. They never understood. Silence was simply where I learned to listen for the numbers that did not belong. I didn't need their approval, their funeral home, or their name. I had my own life, my own work, and for the first time and as long as I could remember, I finally had the quiet to enjoy it. I picked up the pen, looked at the empty page, and started to build a brand new timeline. The game they played for so long was over, and I was the one who finally decided how the story ended. You have spent your entire life believing that your value is tied to what you can do for the people around you, especially the people who share your blood. You have played the role of the fixer, the reliable daughter, the quiet observer who keeps the peace so everyone else can continue their reckless, self-serving lives without consequence. But look at where that silence has brought you. You are not protecting your family by hiding their failures. You were only helping them sharpen the blades they eventually turned on you. The most important lesson you must take from this is that your silence is not a virtue when it is used to cover up someone else's malice. You were taught that being the good daughter meant absorbing their mistakes, cleaning up their messes, and sacrificing your own future so they could maintain their hollow appearances. That is not love, and it is certainly not loyalty. That is a transactional relationship designed to keep you small and compliant. You have to understand that setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of survival. When you allow someone to treat you as a disposable tool for their own agenda, you are essentially telling them that your needs, your professional integrity, and your life simply do not matter. Do not be afraid of the fallout that comes when you finally speak the truth. Yes, they will call you greedy, ungrateful, or cold. But those are just the labels they use to manipulate you into submission. When you choose your own integrity over their approval, you aren't the one destroying the family. You are simply the one who finally refused to participate in the charade. Your bank account, your career, and your private peace are not things you should ever have to apologize for, especially to people who never once hesitated to jeopardize yours. You don't need their validation to be a successful, capable person. You already have all the tools you need to build a life that is entirely your own, free from the burden of keeping their secrets. You have reached a point where you can finally choose who gets access to your life. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, and the people who only loved the version of you that served their needs will simply fall away. That is not a tragedy. That is a necessary cleansing. Take the time to look at your own patterns and ask yourself where you have been settling for less because you were afraid of the conflict that truth brings. Have you ever stayed silent about something you knew was wrong just to keep the peace with someone who never once cared about your peace of mind? What is the one thing you would change about your life right now if you stopped caring what they thought about you?